August 25, 1944, 7 o'clock a.m. Avranches, France. Convoys stretched nose to tail down narrow Norman lanes, olive-drab trucks grinding their gears as fog burned off the hedgerows, painted on each grille a red ball insignia. From horizon to horizon, engines coughed, brakes hissed, and a new war machine emerged. Not tanks or planes, but endless transport columns. German reconnaissance logged the sight with disbelief. Supplies rolling at a scale no Wehrmacht quartermaster could match. This was the dawn of the Red Ball Express, launched late August 1944, remembered as August 25, but with preliminary runs noted as early as August 21. The map table at SHAEF headquarters was already crowded with colored pins tracing the jagged line of Allied armies pressing across France. Eisenhower's patience broke. He struck the table with his fist and barked, "Does any man here, already invade France?" We're stopped not by the enemy, but by gasoline. It was late August 1944. The German army, battered by the breakout from Normandy, was falling back in confusion. In the space of weeks, American and British spearheads had rolled across the bocage and were now pushing through open country. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. Yet the U.S. advance, arguably the most mechanized force the world had ever seen, was now immobilized. Not by German resistance, but by empty fuel tanks. Patton's Third Army was the perfect embodiment of speed. His armored columns, having smashed through the German line in Operation Cobra, were devouring the French countryside at a breathtaking pace. But the very thing that made them lethal also made them vulnerable: consumption. Patton's divisions alone required roughly 350,000 gallons of gasoline every day. By mid-August, they were operating 150 miles beyond the nearest railheads. At least 30 Allied divisions were now in danger of stalling, not because the Wehrmacht had stopped them, but because supply convoys could not keep up. The paradox was clear. The faster the Americans moved, the faster they burned through their lifeline. Every tank mile carried the shadow of a fuel gauge creeping toward empty. France itself could not absorb this demand. Retreating German forces had demolished what they could not hold. Hundreds of bridges lay in twisted heaps, dynamited to deny pursuit. Rail lines were severed in dozens of places, marshalling yards gutted by Allied bombing campaigns that had targeted them for months. The very success of Allied air power had left an unintended side effect. Even when ports were seized, the railways to carry supplies forward were either destroyed or unusable. Ammunition, rations, and fuel stacked up on the beaches, but moving them inland proved another matter entirely. Desperation bred improvisation. Fuel was rationed by headquarters, sometimes as little as a few gallons per vehicle, enough to move artillery only when absolutely needed. In some sectors, gasoline was delivered in 50-gallon drums, parachuted from aircraft into forward fields. Engineers rigged makeshift supply points by siphoning from one unit to another. Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, noted grimly that they had to rob Peter to pay Paul. Armor meant to smash German rearguards sat idle, while priority fuel went to a single division tasked with pursuit. What could have been a rolling collapse of the Wehrmacht turned into a halting grind. Ironically, the Germans were even worse off. Between 75% and 80% of German supply transport was still horse-drawn. Wagon teams clogged muddy lanes, pulling carts of ammunition or sacks of potatoes. Soldiers joked bitterly that their divisions marched at the speed of the horse. Yet for the Americans, the comparison offered little comfort. A mechanized army unable to move was just as crippled as one chained to animals. The great advantage of motorization became a liability when the fuel ran out. For Eisenhower, this was more than inconvenience. It was strategic paralysis. His armies were inside France, but the window of opportunity to exploit German disarray was closing. Every day the U.S. forces idled. the enemy reorganized. Army Group B, though mauled, was retreating toward the fortified West Wall, the Siegfried Line. The Allied Supreme Commander was blunt. Supply governs strategy. Without gasoline, armored thrusts became fantasies drawn on maps. Even victories risked becoming Pyrrhic if troops lacked food or ammunition to hold ground. Patton himself fumed. His diaries from August 1944 contain repeated laments about gasoline shortages. He believed his Third Army could drive directly into Germany if given priority. Instead, he was forced to halt outside Metz, watching opportunities slip away. Later legends painted this as a personal feud. Patton supposedly cheated of glory by Eisenhower's favoritism toward Montgomery's northern thrust. The reality was less dramatic. Fuel allocations were based on strategic balance across the front, not on personalities. But in the heat of the moment, to Patton and his staff, it felt like betrayal. This myth endured, feeding the image of Patton as the warrior held back by timid bureaucrats. The truth was simpler: no trucks, no gas, no war. The deeper irony was unmistakable. America's arsenal had poured out tanks, jeeps, and trucks at rates the world had never seen. Yet by late summer 1944, this strength threatened to choke itself. The more vehicles poured forward, the more fuel they demanded, creating a spiraling dependency. In one sense, the Allies were victims of their own success. They had built an army so powerful and so fast that even their vast supply system could not keep pace. Victory had outrun logistics. At SHAEF headquarters, the mood was tense. Reports arrived of columns halted on French roads, tanks abandoned when their crews siphoned the last drops to keep headquarters vehicles moving. Forward units radioed for fuel that could not be delivered in time. The danger was stark. If German forces regrouped and counterattacked, immobilized Allied armor could be caught vulnerable. The promise of rapid victory after Normandy risked dissolving into stalemate on the French frontier. This was the crisis that would give birth to something extraordinary. The Allies had to invent a solution on the fly, one that could bridge hundreds of miles, carry thousands of tons daily, and function even on shattered infrastructure. In a matter of days, the idea took shape. A continuous flow of trucks, dedicated exclusively to hauling supplies, given priority above all else. Painted on their grills would be a red circle, a symbol borrowed from railroad priority codes. And the name would stick. But in late August, with Eisenhower pounding his map table, none of that was yet certain. What was certain was the irony. The world's most motorized army had been stopped cold, not by enemy fire, but by the fuel it could not deliver. By late August 1944, more than 5,900 trucks had been reassigned to a single mission, non-stop convoys. The order came from the top. Allied planners at the Communications Zone, Comms, Z, the sprawling logistics command that managed the arteries of supply, realized that without a radical new system, the breakout from Normandy would grind to a halt. Trains were crippled, ports bottlenecked, and depots strained to breaking. What remained was the road. Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, head of ComZs, was known for his flamboyant uniforms and iron sense of logistics. In August 1944, he issued the directive that would become legendary: establish a dedicated express highway of trucks, operating day and night, carrying only priority cargo. Colonel Loren Ayres of the Motor Transport Service and Colonel Ewart Plank, another logistics officer, were tasked with execution. Their challenge was immense. They needed to coordinate thousands of drivers, secure routes across a countryside still littered with debris, and guarantee flow rates never before attempted in modern war. The concept was simple, almost brutal in its clarity. Nothing moved on these roads but supply trucks. Other traffic was forbidden. Military police would enforce it without hesitation. The Americans had invented their own rolling railroad. The Red Ball Express, as it would soon be called, linked the beaches to the front. The main line stretched from the Normandy ports at Cherbourg, through supply depots near Chartres, and forward to the combat divisions clawing toward the Seine and beyond. The round trip was roughly 400 miles, often covered by men who drove until their eyes burned from fatigue. At every depot, cargo was swapped: ammunition, rations, fuel, medical supplies. Each truck was tagged for priority. A load of gasoline for Patton's armor might take precedence over anything else. Drivers learned quickly that the route was unforgiving. Once rolling, you did not stop unless ordered, or unless your truck died under you. The figures told the story of scale. 132 truck companies were reassigned at the outset. By late August, 5,900 trucks were running daily. The convoys carried between 5,000 and 12,500 tons per day, with peaks in early September when momentum was highest. Convoy rules were explicit: a maximum of 25 EMPs, with 60-yard intervals between vehicles, and 10-minute halts before each hour to prevent overheating and fatigue. Military police directed traffic, turning rural French roads into one-way loops. A truck that broke down was pushed off immediately. Better to lose one vehicle than hold up the stream. What this meant in practice was extraordinary. An unbroken line of trucks, bumper to bumper by the standards of wartime, threading across France 24 hours a day. The name Red Ball carried a symbolic weight that has often been misunderstood. To later generations, it sounded like soldier's slang, a casual nickname invented on the fly. In reality, it came from the railroad industry. Freight, marked with a red ball, had the highest priority: express shipments that cleared all tracks ahead. Army planners borrowed the term deliberately. Convoy trucks bore red ball insignias, painted on signs and posted along the roads, reminding everyone these vehicles had absolute precedence. When locals saw the endless olive-drab columns rolling past, they understood this was America's war machine, and it never stopped moving. Eisenhower himself later wrote in his memoir, "Without supplies, armies are nothing." It was both truism and understatement. The Red Ball Express proved it. No amount of courage at the front mattered if the barrels were dry, the guns empty, or the rations gone. Logistics was not glamour, it was victory. Even at Schaeff, Eisenhower knew he had unleashed something that broke the old separation between combat and support. Truck drivers, once dismissed as rear echelon men, were now lifeline carriers who risked ambush, fatigue, and accidents in every run. The contrast with Germany was stark. The Wehrmacht relied almost entirely on railroads for bulk supply. Those rails had been pounded mercilessly by Allied air forces since before D-Day. By August, bridges and junctions lay shattered. Trains were destroyed in their sidings before they could move. The Red Ball was different. It could reroute around wreckage, bypass a cratered bridge with a farm road, or adjust flow within hours. Trucks lacked the efficiency of rail, but they possessed flexibility. And flexibility won wars of movement. For the Germans, watching reconnaissance photographs of columns snaking across France, the sight was unnerving. To them it looked as though America had conjured highways out of nothing, turning the French road network into a mobile arsenal. There was deep irony in the birth of the Express. Trucks had never been considered glamorous weapons. Pilots, tankers, infantry, those were the heroes. A man in a cab, grinding gears through dust, was anonymous. Yet by late summer 1944, these anonymous drivers were as critical to Allied strategy as any ace or general. What the Germans had once mocked as America's obsession with machines was now America's secret strength. The rear echelon was no longer in the rear. It was at the heart of the campaign. Later histories sometimes painted the Red Ball as a spontaneous nickname, a bit of soldier folklore. The truth is less romantic but more telling. Red Ball was deliberate. a conscious import from railroad practice, emphasizing priority and efficiency. Equally, it was never a perfect solution. The convoys strained roads, devoured spare parts, and exhausted men. But in those crucial weeks, they did exactly what they were meant to: keep the Allied advance alive. By the first week of September, the Red Ball Express was in full swing. Thousands of trucks roared down French lanes, headlights hooded against enemy planes, their loads destined for tank columns pressing east. The sound became part of the war itself, a grinding thunder of engines that carried the weight of an army. The United States had found its answer to the fuel crisis. The Red Ball Express was not elegant, nor sustainable long-term, but it was revolutionary in its improvisation. Logistics had become a weapon in its own right, and once unleashed, it would carry Allied armies through the autumn toward the German frontier. Headlights tunneled through French night roads, engines rattling as tired hands clutched wheels. Dust from the day still clung to their uniforms. The drivers leaned forward, eyes fixed on the tail lights ahead, each man willing himself not to nod off. The convoy rolled on, a steel river in the dark. The Red Ball Express was not just trucks and tonnage, it was people. At its peak, nearly 23,000 men drove those endless convoys, most of them young, most barely trained for the task. And roughly 70 to 75% were African American, soldiers of a segregated army that had assigned them to service units rather than combat formations. They came from Mississippi, Chicago, New Jersey, and small towns scattered across America. Many had never seen France before the war. Now they saw it only through windshields, streaked with mud and dust as the countryside blurred past at 25 miles an hour, faster when urgency pressed. SGT. Eddie Carter of the 364th Quartermaster Truck Company remembered the monotony. "You didn't dare lose sight of the man in front," he recalled after the war. "Lose him, and you were lost." P.L. Harold Warren of the 514th Truck Regiment wrote letters home describing the rattle of loose bolts, the stink of gasoline drums, the constant thrum of engines in his ears long after he shut his eyes. Their workhorse was the GMC 21/2-ton truck, known to all as the Deuce and a Half. It carried a 5,000-pound payload, fuel drums, ammunition, crates of rations. The trucks were simple, rugged, and just barely powerful enough to drag themselves up the hills of Normandy when loaded to the brim. Every driver learned the quirks of his machine, how to double clutch gears, when to nurse a failing brake, how to keep an overheating engine alive another 10 miles. A man's life depended on his truck finishing the run, and often the lives of others if that truck carried gasoline bound for tanks in combat. Official convoy rules mandated 25 miles per hour, headlights dimmed or blacked out, 60-yard spacing, and brief halts before each hour. In practice, few convoys held to the regulations. Commanders demanded speed, and drivers pushed harder. Trucks bounced over potholes at 35 or 40, jarring the bones of the men inside. The greatest enemy was not the Germans, but fatigue. Men drove 20 hours or more in a single shift, grabbed 3 or 4 hours of sleep, then climbed back behind the wheel. Coffee and cigarettes dulled exhaustion, but never killed it. Accidents were inevitable. Trucks flipped into ditches, collided on tight curves, or simply ran off the road when drivers fell asleep. Official reports listed dozens killed in accidents or occasional Luftwaffe strafing, but veterans remembered far more near misses. Trucks tipping onto 2 wheels, brakes failing on downslopes, engines seizing in the middle of nowhere. "You didn't think about dying," Warren recalled later. "You thought about staying awake. Dying was easier to imagine than falling asleep at the wheel because one, you couldn't stop, the other, you had to fight every second." Here lay the deeper irony. The men who kept the Allied advance alive were the very men whom their own country had pushed to the margins. The U.S. Army of 1944 remained segregated. Black soldiers were shunted into service units. labor battalions, quartermaster corps, trucking companies, under the belief they were less fit for combat. Yet these units now carried the lifeline of the war. General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., the highest-ranking black officer in the Army, visited the convoys and recognized what it meant. In private letters, he urged Washington to acknowledge the contribution, warning that the hypocrisy of fighting Hitler while segregating Americans would stain the victory. Drivers saw the contradiction every day. White MPs waved them through checkpoints but rarely saluted. Dining halls remained separate at depots, and yet, without their trucks, the front would wither. The contrast with Nazi ideology was brutal and ironic. Hitler's regime exalted racial hierarchy, mocked black Americans as inferior, and used propaganda cartoons to ridicule U.S. forces for deploying them. German diaries sneered at the Negertruppen they captured in North Africa and Italy. But in France, those same inferiors were the ones hauling 12,000 tons of supplies a day, delivering the ammunition and gasoline that crushed the Reich. The Wehrmacht, reliant on horse-drawn wagons for 75–80% of transport, could only watch as convoys of African-American drivers sped past their collapsing fronts. The propaganda collapsed against the reality of the road. Though German air power had been gutted, occasional strafing runs still struck convoys. Veterans remembered hugging the ditch as machine gun bullets tore into tarpaulins, exploding fuel drums in fireballs that lit the French night. But the greater danger remained mechanical, a brake failure on a descent, or fatigue in the cab. ASF, Army Service Forces, reports logged casualty lists with clinical detachment. Oral histories decades later put the flesh back on the bones. One driver recalled a friend crushed when his truck rolled. Another spoke of pulling comrades from a burning load of gasoline. For every convoy that arrived safely, there was always the possibility that one wouldn't. Yet the express never stopped. Years later, in a post-war interview, a driver captured the meaning of their service. "We didn't fight with rifles, we fought with wheels." It was not glamorous. It lacked medals or headlines. But those wheels kept Patton's armor fueled, Bradley's infantry fed, and Eisenhower's strategy alive. Here was the irony in its rawest form. Men who wore the uniform of a country that segregated them, men denied entry into combat arms, men excluded from officer clubs and even some canteens, were the ones who delivered the decisive edge. They were invisible in 1944, but indispensable to 1945. The Express was their battlefield. Their enemy was fatigue, narrow French roads, and the endless distance between Cherbourg and Chartres. Their weapon was the deuce and a half. Their victory was measured not in territory taken, but in gallons delivered and shells supplied. It is tempting to say that all the drivers were black. That was not true. White truck companies also ran the convoys, and white mechanics labored in depots. The Red Ball Express was not a monolith. But the fact remains, African-American soldiers made up the majority, by far, and carried the weight disproportionately. To erase that would be as dishonest as overstating it. The truth lies in proportion and recognition, 70 to 75%, a number that gave flesh to the contradiction of a segregated democracy fighting for freedom. Despite hardship, there was also pride. Convoys became rolling communities, each driver depending on the man ahead and behind. Camaraderie formed in the shared misery of sleepless nights and endless roads. Carter later joked that he could recognize the cough of his buddy's truck engine before he saw the headlights. In those fleeting bonds lay the proof of something greater. Even in a segregated army, the men at the wheel forged their own brotherhood. They did not need medals to know what they had achieved. The road itself testified. The headlights tunneled on, one pair after another, cutting through French nights until dawn. Drivers slumped in their seats, fighting to keep eyes open, steering America's arsenal eastward. Each mile delivered another fragment of victory. In a war where generals drew the arrows on maps, These men were the ones who made the arrows move. Army Group B Diary, September 1944. The Americans conjure endless columns from the sea. The phrase, scribbled by a harried staff officer, captured the bewilderment of the German command. For weeks, Wehrmacht reconnaissance units had reported seeing unbroken convoys of trucks flowing across the French countryside. From Normandy's hedgerows to the Seine, from Avranches to Chartres, it looked to the Germans as if the Americans had built a new army out of wheels. Generalleutnant Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Army Group B, studied the reports. A veteran of Poland and France in 1940, he had once marveled at German mobility. But the tables had turned. Where German panzer spearheads had once roared forward, now the enemy's convoys seemed endless. Blumentritt wrote that the Allies feed their armies by road, and the roads do not break. He noted that the Americans had made French lanes into rails of rubber. The comparison was apt. The Wehrmacht's supply arteries had been almost entirely dependent on rail. By 1944, those rails were smashed day after day by Allied bombers. Inside the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, strategists wrestled with figures that seemed impossible. Allied intelligence estimated U.S. production at nearly 600,000 trucks in 1944 alone, compared to Germany's constrained and faltering industry. By late summer, 75 to 80% of German divisional transport was still horse-drawn. Ammunition, fuel, even artillery pieces moved at the pace of hooves. A panzer division might boast tanks, but its supply tail often resembled something from 1914. Meanwhile, German intelligence miscalculated. Captured documents later showed they had underestimated U.S. truck fleets in France by a factor of 3 to 4. They simply could not conceive that such vast numbers of vehicles existed, let alone that they were being poured into a single supply route. When Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights survived Allied air cover long enough to return, their photos showed convoys nose to tail, stretching across French roads. German reports noted the appearance of circular symbols painted on signs. What they could not know was that these marked the Red Ball Express routes. By early September, the Red Ball Express was carrying up to 12,500 tons per day. To German staff officers reading these numbers, the effect was crushing. They had been taught that logistics limited war, that supply dictated tempo. But here, supply seemed limitless. The Luftwaffe attempted to interdict. The Luftwaffe managed only sporadic raids against the convoys. Allied air superiority and weather limited their impact. Most were pinpricks, fighter bombers, strafing trucks, or bombers hitting suspected depots. The results were negligible. By 1944, Allied air superiority meant German pilots rarely reached the convoys, and when they did, they met swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. One driver remembered ditching his truck as a Focke-Wulf 190 sprayed bullets down a road, igniting fuel drums in an orange blaze. Such attacks were terrifying but rare. For every truck lost, 100 more kept moving. Generalfeldmarschall Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, understood the danger better than most. Nicknamed the Führer's fireman for his skill in crisis, Model scoured his staff reports. He knew that his retreating formations were being hunted not only by tanks, but by the inexhaustible lifeline that fed those tanks. In September 1944, Model complained to OKW that the Allies seemed to manufacture roads. To him, the sight of convoys across the Seine was more alarming than any armored column, because it meant the Allies would not pause. Germany's strategy relied on buying time for the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, to absorb the blow, but time was running out, carried away in GMC trucks. At the Wolf's Lair, General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at OKW, briefed Hitler. He admitted the Allies had found unexpected elasticity in supply. Hitler dismissed the reports, insisting the Americans could not sustain such extravagance for long. He had always believed that democracies were weak, unable to stomach prolonged sacrifice. Yet Hitler's intuition failed him. Far from collapsing, the American system was only accelerating. For Jerdl, forced to balance dwindling German fuel allocations, the comparison was humiliating. His memos recorded a blunt truth. Our trains burn, their trucks multiply. Captured documents after the war confirmed how blind German intelligence had been. G2 summaries showed they consistently underestimated Allied truck strength, even when photographic evidence suggested otherwise. Reports often dismissed convoys as temporary or exaggerated. This blindness had real consequences. German commanders assumed the Allies would be forced to halt for weeks while rebuilding rails. Instead, the Red Ball kept armies moving east at a tempo the Wehrmacht could not match. One German officer, captured later in 1944 and interviewed in Allied custody, admitted in frustration, "Our trains burned, their trucks multiplied." To him, it seemed as if every time a German depot was destroyed, another American convoy materialized to replace it. He and his comrades were stunned at how swiftly ruined bridges or depots meant nothing to the enemy. The contrast was more than technical, it was psychological. German reliance on railroads tied them to static lines easily bombed. American reliance on trucks freed them from rail bottlenecks and offered resilience. One system cracked under pressure, the other bent, rerouted, and kept going. For the men writing reports in OKW, the sight of olive-drab trucks proved that the enemy had taken the very concept of Bürgerkrieg, war of movement, that Germany had pioneered and surpassed it. Here lay the great irony. The Germans had once shocked the world with blitzkrieg armored thrusts supplied by speed and coordination. But by 1944, the inventors of rapid war were stranded, their panzers short of fuel, their horses pulling wagons through the mud. The Americans, once mocked as clumsy and materialistic, had mastered speed through logistics. The Wehrmacht had become the static force, paralyzed by shortages. The United States, with its convoys, had become the master of mobility. By September's end, German commanders no longer asked whether the Allies could sustain their advance. They asked only when and where the next blow would fall. Every staff report noted the same ominous refrain. The Americans had made roads into weapons. The Army Group B diary's haunting line, "The Americans conjure endless columns from the sea," was not exaggeration. It was the recognition of a new kind of war, one Germany had no answer for. The Red Ball Express had become more than a supply system. In the eyes of the enemy, it was a juggernaut, rolling on rubber wheels, grinding down the last illusions of German recovery. Mud spattered as convoys fishtailed on farm lanes, drivers cursing shredded tires. Autumn rains turned French roads into slick ribbons, rutted and treacherous. Dust that had coated trucks in August gave way to clinging mud in September. Every mile carried a new obstacle, a broken bridge, a cratered lane, a culvert washed out by rain. For the Red Ball Express, the war was no longer only against distance, it was against the roads themselves. From late August through November 1944, the Red Ball Express hauled over 400,000 tons of supplies. Ammunition, fuel, rations, spare parts, all moved by truck, all dependent on weary drivers and fragile machines. But every ton carried forward came at a cost. The Transportation Corps, under General Charles P. Gross, watched with alarm as breakdown reports piled up. At headquarters near Paris and depots at Chartres, officers pored over maintenance logs that read like casualty lists. A single day might see hundreds of trucks immobilized, axles snapped, engines overheated, transmissions ground to failure. Gross demanded solutions, but solutions were as improvised as the convoys themselves. The Express had been conceived as a temporary measure, Now it was being asked to sustain an entire theater of war. The weakest link was often the tire. Roads shredded rubber faster than depots could supply replacements. Trucks bounced along cobbled village streets, then sloshed through mud, then ground over rubble where bridges had collapsed. Tire life measured in thousands of miles under peacetime conditions shrank to a few hundred under the Red Ball's punishment. Cole Lauren Ayres, charged with overseeing convoy operations, reported that depots sometimes ran out of tires entirely. Mechanics scavenged rubber from wrecked trucks, or patched holes with whatever material they had. A driver recalled, "We'd cut sections from blown tires, nail them over holes, and hope the patch lasted to chart." For every truck rolling forward, another seemed to sit on the roadside, jacked up, wheels bare. The image of endless convoys masked the reality that attrition stalked every mile. The paradox of the Red Ball Express was never clearer than with gasoline. Convoys often carried nothing but fuel, barrels stacked high, tankers filled to capacity. By autumn, the Express was hauling over 1 million gallons of fuel per day. But every gallon delivered cost gallons burned. GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks consumed their own measure of fuel on the round trip, sometimes as much as a quarter of what they carried. One officer dryly noted, "We're burning gas to haul gas." Still, the arithmetic favored the Allies. Even with inefficiency, the flow was massive enough to keep armor moving. For German commanders watching from the other side, the irony was brutal. Their panzers starved for lack of fuel, while American convoys guzzled gasoline just to haul more. Maj. Jane Thomas Handy, Deputy Chief of Staff, visited forward depots in September and was struck by the makeshift workshops. Mechanics worked under apple trees, mud sucking at their boots, engines hoisted from hoods by block and tackle lashed to branches. A letter from one mechanic captured the spirit. "We rebuild engines under apple trees." The line became shorthand for the ingenuity of the transportation corps. Repair units, some 350 mobile maintenance teams in all, roamed the routes, rescuing stricken vehicles, cannibalizing parts from wrecks, and coaxing crippled trucks back to life. To soldiers on the line, this constant improvisation mattered as much as combat bravery. A single convoy of gasoline that arrived on time meant tanks could launch an attack the next morning. A missed convoy might mean postponement or disaster. For drivers, the grind grew harsher with every week. Fatigue that had been tolerable in August turned deadly by October. Nights grew longer, rains heavier, and accidents more common. ASF reports noted dozens killed each month, not by enemy fire, but by overturned trucks, head-on collisions on narrow lanes, or explosions when gasoline ignited. Survivors carried the memories. One driver remembered pulling his friend from a cab after a head-on crash. Another recalled diving into a ditch as a truck full of shells detonated behind him. This was the hidden casualty list of the Red Ball. Men lost to the road, their sacrifice rarely noted in front-page headlines. On the other side, German supply depots offered a contrast that underscored Allied resilience. Where American convoys rerouted and repaired on the fly, German depots were obliterated by bombers. Photographs showed acres of shattered fuel drums, locomotives twisted on their sides, entire rail junctions reduced to smoking craters. For German units at the front, resupply became guesswork. Ammunition arrived late, if at all. Rations dwindled. In the Ardennes, soldiers butchered horses for food. Against this backdrop, the sight of American convoys rolling without pause was maddening. The legend of the Red Ball Express often paints it as an inexhaustible river of supply. The reality was more fragile. Every ton carried forward stretched the system closer to breaking. Depots at Chartres groaned under the strain of balancing allocations. Armies at the front still complained of shortages, of fuel arriving late, of ammunition rationed, of rations thin. Even as the Express delivered 400,000 tons in less than 3 months, it was not enough to satisfy the insatiable appetite of modern mechanized war. Eisenhower himself admitted that logistics dictated tempo more than strategy. Generals could dream of breakthroughs, but only the convoys could make them possible. The irony was bitter and sharp. The very trucks that carried fuel consumed it in staggering amounts. The very system that kept the armies alive devoured itself with every mile. Yet the balance still favored the Americans. They could afford inefficiency, their enemy could not. For the Germans, every gallon lost was irreplaceable. For the Allies, every gallon burned was the price of an advance that could not be stopped. In the end, the Red Ball Express was not just a supply system, it was a battle of attrition against mud, weather, fatigue, and machine failure. Soldiers learned to curse and love their trucks in the same breath. Convoys fishtailed through farm lanes, their drivers gripping wheels with white knuckles. Mechanics patched engines in orchards. MPs waved traffic on as rain slicked their uniforms. Every man in the chain understood. Victory in France depended not only on the tank crews and infantrymen, but on the men who kept wheels turning despite everything the roads could throw at them. The Express rolled on, but in its mud-spattered wake lay broken trucks, burned-out engines, and men who paid with their lives to keep the advance alive. Victory in that autumn of 1944 was measured not only by ground gained, but by the sheer endurance of the drivers and mechanics who dragged the war forward mile by mile. By November, Red Ball convoys had delivered nearly 400,000 tons, yet divisions still cried shortage. The numbers looked staggering on paper. 400,000 tons in just 3 months, carried by trucks over battered French roads. But at the German border, those tons dissolved into hunger, cold, and stalled momentum. For all the triumph of the Red Ball Express, Allied divisions pressing toward Germany discovered the one truth every general already knew: no supply line, however ingenious, could feed an army larger than its capacity. By mid-November 1944, the Allies stood at the gates of Germany. Patton's armor had driven into Lorraine. The British had crossed into the Low Countries. American infantry divisions battered at the approaches to Aachen, the first German city to fall. Yet the great rush of August and September was over. The culprit was not German recovery, at least not yet. It was the arithmetic of logistics. Each division required 650 to 700 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel, medical stores. At peak throughputs, 12,500 tons/day, Red Ball could sustain roughly 1820 divisions. At 657 tons/division/day, on typical days, 5,000–6,000 tons, it covered roughly 7–9 divisions. But Eisenhower commanded over 60 active divisions in the European theater. The sums did not match. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, leading the U.S. First Army, faced the consequences firsthand. His men fought street by street in Aachen, only to find artillery rationed, tank units grounded, and rations short. Engineers built bridges faster than gasoline arrived to cross them. Reports from SHAEF noted fuel allocations dropping to 5 gallons per vehicle per day in some frontline units. Jeeps that should have patrolled freely were parked, used only for emergency runs. Infantry marched on foot, while their supporting armor waited for convoys delayed by rain or breakdowns. To the north, Lieutenant General William Simpson's Ninth Army faced similar frustrations. Pushing toward the Ruhr River, Simpson found that fuel deliveries fluctuated so wildly he could not plan more than a few days ahead. One staff officer called it strategy by convoy schedule. The irony was bitter. Never in history had an army been so well supplied in absolute terms, yet the scale of operations meant even abundance felt like famine. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group, pressed Eisenhower for priority. His forces, he argued, were closest to the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. But Eisenhower resisted narrowing the advance to a single spearhead. The result was that all armies advanced slowly, none decisively. Montgomery put the problem in stark words in a letter to Eisenhower. Strategy dictated by petrol. It was not rhetoric. The entire autumn campaign revolved around fuel timetables. When gasoline flowed, tanks moved. When it did not, divisions dug in and waited. The Red Ball itself was faltering. By October, autumn rains had turned routes into bogs. Convoy capacity fell by about 25%. As mud swallowed trucks, accidents multiplied, and engines seized in the cold. The engineers at Chartres depots struggled to keep up. Maintenance crews patched thousands of trucks weekly, but the strain was relentless. Mechanics cannibalized parts from wrecks just to keep convoys limping forward. A miracle system was becoming a grinding war of attrition with the weather. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line, known to Germans as the West Wall, 18,000 pillboxes, bunkers, and tank obstacles stretching for hundreds of miles. The fortifications had been mocked before the war as propaganda relics. Now, manned by desperate defenders, they became formidable. German units inside the line starved for supplies themselves. Fuel allocations were so meager that entire divisions rotated artillery pieces between sectors. But even half-starved, German defenders used the bunkers to slow the Allied advance. The Allies had the strength to break through. What they lacked was the steady torrent of fuel and ammunition to do it quickly. Shape's ration board minutes from November tell the story. Pages record desperate adjustments. Divisions receiving 70% of authorized fuel. Artillery shells rationed by battery. Priorities shifted daily. Reports circulated of divisions carrying only half their normal ammunition into combat. In Washington, the War Department struggled to understand. How could an army that had delivered so much still claim shortage? The answer lay in the ratio of supply to demand. Mechanized war consumed beyond any precedent. The contrast between the two sides was dramatic. Germany's defenders crouched in bunkers, short of shells, rationing bread and gasoline, clinging to the concrete of the Siegfried Line. The United States rolled convoys carrying thousands of tons per day, yet still complained it was not enough. For Germans, the shortages meant paralysis. For Americans, shortages meant slower advance. One army lived on starvation, the other on gluttony that could not quite keep pace. The Red Ball Express was a triumph, a system created in desperation that had delivered the impossible. And yet, the miracle was not sufficient. Even America's industrial flood could not perfectly match the appetite of modern mechanized war. The irony was stark. The greatest logistics operation in history was still insufficient. Drivers cursed, mechanics patched, generals rationed, and the advance stalled at the very moment victory seemed near. As November turned to December, snow began to fall. Eisenhower looked east across the German border and knew he was trapped between abundance and shortage. He commanded the largest army Europe had ever seen, fed by convoys that had moved nearly 500,000 tons, yet he could not break through quickly. The Siegfried Line stood not only as concrete, but as a symbol, the point where America's momentum collided with the limits of its own logistics. The Red Ball Express had carried the Allies to the German frontier. But at the gates of the Reich, even miracles had their limits. December 16, 1944, snow cracked under German boots as the Ardennes offensive began. From the forests of Luxembourg and Belgium, 3 German armies surged west. Columns of Panthers and Volksgrenadiers pushed into snow-covered valleys, their assault cloaked in fog. The Ardennes offensive, what the Allies would call the Battle of the Bulge, caught Eisenhower's command off guard. At Bastogne, crossroads of 7 highways, the 101st Airborne dug in. At headquarters, radios crackled with a single demand: fuel. The offensive's entire premise rested on fuel. German planners knew they lacked the reserves for a prolonged campaign. Their solution was bold to the point of desperation: seize Allied fuel dumps and use captured gasoline to keep panzers moving. General Hasso von Manteuffel, leading 5th Panzer Army, pressed his men forward with orders to capture depots intact. Yet by December, American engineers had already prepared to torch stalks at the first sign of enemy approach. The gamble made German columns both dangerous and brittle, mobile only if they stole what the Allies had built. By mid-November 1944, the Red Ball Express had been discontinued as rail, ports, and pipelines came online. During the Ardennes crisis, ad hoc express truck routes revived the Red Ball model in practice. Emergency convoys rerouted fuel and ammunition to the Bulge, often under snow and ice. Records from the Transportation Corps show that by late December, over 300,000 gallons of fuel per day were being redirected to the battle sector. Convoys pushed through snow and ice, headlights hooded, men gripping steering wheels with frozen fingers. For the drivers, it was the worst winter they had ever known. Trucks skidded on black ice, overturned into ditches, or simply froze when engines seized. Attrition soared. Yet, the convoys kept coming. In the town of Bastogne, roughly 11,000 defenders of the 101st Airborne and detached units huddled against artillery and snow. Ammunition ran low, rations thinned, fuel for jeeps and half-tracks dwindled. Every Allied truck forced through the Ardennes meant another day the garrison could hold. When German envoys demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back his laconic reply, "Nuts." Behind that defiance lay confidence that supplies and relief would come. They were not wrong. General George S. Patton, commanding 3rd Army to the south, made his own gamble. In less than 48 hours, he pivoted 3 divisions northward, a feat of maneuver as much logistical as tactical. The roads were icy, the weather brutal, but Patton's men rolled forward. In his diary, he captured the essence of the battle. "The trucks are our guns now." Without convoys to carry fuel and shells, his rapid counterattack would have been impossible. The very trucks that had once fed his advance across France now became the weapon to blunt Hitler's last throw. For the drivers, the Ardennes was a nightmare. Convoys crept through forests where German infiltrators in American uniforms spread confusion. Snow and ice turned every curve into a hazard. Engines froze, men froze with them. Transportation Corps after-action reports described convoys abandoned in drifts, trucks stripped for parts under shell fire, gasoline igniting in white-hot bursts when shells struck. Yet each day, more convoys were dispatched, losses mounted, but the flow never stopped. German raids targeted fuel dumps, sometimes igniting whole depots in flames visible for miles. But for every gallon destroyed, more were already en route. The contrast between the two armies was brutal. German panzers advanced until their fuel tanks ran dry. Captured American gasoline was often the only thing that kept them moving. Yet the more they relied on seizing Allied depots, the more brittle their offensive became. Allied convoys, by contrast, replenished endlessly. Even with weather, accidents, and German attacks, the system flexed but did not break. Trucks that crashed were dragged aside, columns rerouted, drivers pressed on through night and storm. Manteuffel later admitted that his forces ran out of petrol before we ran out of courage. The Allies, drowned in abundance, denied him the miracle he needed. Quartermaster logs for December 1944 recorded the extraordinary effort. One entry noted the diversion of entire convoy groups from depots near Chartres straight to Patton's spearheads. Another listed tonnage shifts, hour by hour, as if the battle were being fought in ledger books as much as in foxholes. These documents reveal how thin the margin was. Supply officers spoke of gambling everything on keeping Bastogne alive, of stripping sectors to feed Patton's thrust. The Red Ball was no longer just an express, it was a lifeline under fire. Here lay the final irony. Hitler had unleashed the Ardennes offensive to seize Allied fuel, but the attempt only underscored his army's dependence. German tanks rolled until they ran out of gasoline. American trucks, in contrast, consumed fuel prodigiously, but delivered even more. The very weakness Hitler tried to exploit, Allied reliance on gasoline, proved his undoing. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht's last major offensive in the West had collapsed, starved of fuel. The Red Ball and its convoys had ensured the Allies could recover, regroup, and counterstrike. By the end of January, the snow receded, the bulge was flattened, the German offensive broken. Convoys once more flowed eastward, feeding the final drive into the heart of the Reich. The Red Ball Express had survived its greatest test. It had adapted, rerouted, and endured, and in doing so, it had turned Hitler's last gamble into his final failure. The Ardennes showed the truth Eisenhower had known all along. Battles are won by men, but wars are won by supply. The trucks were not just wheels on roads, they were the arteries of victory. The Red Ball Express was the lifeline of our army. Eisenhower's words, written after the war, distilled the paradox of the convoys. They had been a desperate improvisation, born out of shortage and crisis. By the winter of 1944–45, they were something else. An icon. Yet the very system that carried the Allies across France was already giving way to something more permanent. From late August to mid-November 1944, the Red Ball Express hauled roughly 412,000 tons of supplies. It was a staggering achievement, a continuous stream of trucks rolling day and night, delivering the fuel and shells that made victory possible. But by early 1945, those numbers were dwarfed by what the Allied armies required. Eisenhower's vast forces were consuming well over 10 million gallons of fuel every week, a scale no road-only system could sustain. The crisis had been met. The emergency bridge had done its work. Now, more stable systems had to take over. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone, COMZEDS, had always envisioned the Red Ball as temporary. His staff began shifting emphasis to rail restoration, port development, and pipelines. COMZEDS reports from early 1945 show the transition. Fewer dedicated truck convoys, more reliance on rebuilt infrastructure. The massive depots at Chartres and elsewhere remained busy, but the Express as a branded system was phased out. Supply, once a desperate sprint, became a steadier flow. The U.S. Army's engineers quietly accomplished miracles of their own. By the spring of 1945, they had rebuilt more than 1,500 bridges across France and Belgium. Railroads were restored, tracks relaid, locomotives imported from the United States. Where convoys had once been the only answer, now trains could carry tonnage far more efficiently. The engineers did what trucks could not. They gave the Allies permanence. What the Red Ball had bridged in emergency, the rails and bridges now made sustainable. Perhaps the most dramatic solution was invisible. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, had been planned before D-Day, but by 1945 it reached full capacity. From Britain to the continent, flexible pipelines carried fuel directly to forward depots. At peak output, Pluto delivered close to 1 million gallons of fuel per day. For commanders like Eisenhower and Patton, it was a miracle. Fuel flowing without trucks, without risk of air attack, without the endless grind of drivers battling mud and fatigue. The pipeline was not perfect, vulnerable to breaks, demanding constant repair, but it represented a leap forward. It was the kind of infrastructure that would outlast a single campaign. As rails and pipelines took the burden, the convoys thinned. By early 1945, more than 6,000 trucks that had once belonged to the Red Ball Express were reassigned to other routes, supporting depots or hauling for divisions directly. Men who had driven 20-hour shifts in autumn now found themselves scattered across Europe, some delivering supplies to liberated camps, others carrying fuel into Germany itself. The Express faded not with a bang, but with a quiet reallocation of wheels and manpower. Post-war films and memoirs sometimes exaggerated the Red Ball Express as if it alone had carried the Allied armies across Europe. The truth was more complex. The Express was vital in the crisis of autumn 1944, but it was one layer in a system, joined by ports, railways, engineer battalions, and pipeline. The caution is necessary. To elevate the Red Ball as the sole artery is to miss the scale of Allied logistics. It was an emergency tourniquet, not the bloodstream itself. Yet that tourniquet saved the patient long enough for surgery. The difference between emergency and permanence defined the winter. Convoys remained flexible, able to detour around destruction, but they were costly and fragile. Trains and pipelines, once restored, offered far greater efficiency. This was the contrast. The Red Ball Express as improvisation and the rebuilt infrastructure as strategy. Together, they formed the complete picture. The Germans, by contrast, never escaped dependence on rail. With depots shattered and fuel cut off, their armies shrank to immobility. For them, logistics meant paralysis. For the Allies, even when improvisation gave way to structure, supply meant motion. Eisenhower's remark about the Red Ball as the lifeline was not romantic exaggeration. He knew better than anyone how close his armies had come to halting in September 1944. He had seen Patton's tanks stall for want of fuel, seen ration boards cut allocations to 5 gallons per jeep per day, seen strategy constrained not by maps, but by convoys. The Express had been the hinge. Without it, the drive from Normandy would have collapsed into delay. With it, the Allies reached Germany before the year's end. Here was the final irony. What began as a desperate patch, an improvisation to keep armies moving for a few critical weeks, became a symbol of modern war. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics was not background but weapon field, not support but weapon. Its very obsolescence by 1945 only sharpened the point. The Express faded because it had done its job too well, because it had bridged the gap until pipelines, rails, and ports could take over. The stopgap became the legend. The convoys rolled less frequently now, but their echo remained. Drivers who once cursed mud and skidded on ice could look back and know they had carried victory forward. The Red Ball Express was gone, but its shadow stretched into history, proof that in the greatest war the world had ever known, wheels and fuel could matter as much as guns and tanks. By 1945, U.S. forces had moved over 16 million tons across Europe, Red Ball just one artery of the heart. The scale of supply was almost unimaginable. Trains, ships, depots, pipelines, and convoys combining into a single system that smothered the Reich. The Red Ball Express, though it lasted barely 3 months in its purest form, became its most remembered symbol. When the war ended, historians of logistics looked not only at battles but at ledgers. The U.S. Army's Transportation Corps reported that from 1944 to 1945, more than 16 million tons were moved across the European theater. Trucks, rails, and pipelines carried the flow of an industrial continent harnessed for war. General Brehon B. Somerville, the architect of Army supply, emphasized that logistics absorbed about 45% of all U.S. manpower. Nearly half of the American war effort was dedicated not to firing bullets, but to moving them. It was a reminder that wars are fought with soldiers, but won with sustainment. Between 1939 and 1945, the United States built roughly 2.4 million trucks. They were the quiet miracle of Detroit, as important in their way as tanks or aircraft. Without them, the Red Ball Express would never have existed. The GMC Deuce and a Half became the symbol of the American war machine. Not glamorous, not fearsome, but reliable. Veterans later said it carried the Allies farther than any single weapon. One British general quipped, "The war was won by the Jeep and the Deuce and a Half." The story could never be told without its drivers. Roughly 70 to 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American. In a segregated army, they were assigned to service units, barred from combat commands. Yet it was they who carried the lifeline forward. Decades later, their voices filled oral histories. One driver said in the 1970s, "We weren't heroes, they just couldn't win without us." The humility masked the truth. They were both. Unsung heroes who delivered victory while denied full recognition in their own country. The irony was sharp. Segregated units delivered the supplies that liberated Europe from racial tyranny. Men marginalized in Mississippi or Chicago were indispensable in Metz and Bastogne. President Harry S. Truman, himself a veteran artillery officer of the First World War, understood what logistics meant. He praised the Transportation Corps as the veins and arteries of victory. Under his presidency, the armed forces would be ordered toward desegregation, a step influenced, in part, by the wartime record of units like those who drove the Red Ball. Later scholars gave shape to the verdict. Military historian Martin van Creveld argued that logistics, more than any battlefield tactic, determined modern war. In his analysis, the Red Ball Express became a case study, the moment when improvisation saved strategy, and when men behind the lines proved as decisive as those at the front. It was not glamorous, it was not the stuff of parades, but it was decisive. The contrast in memory reflected the contrast in experience. German veterans remembered hunger, marching on empty stomachs, panzers abandoned when fuel was gone, horses butchered for food. They recalled shortages, starvation, and immobilization. American veterans, by contrast, remembered abundance, tempered by exhaustion. They remembered convoys that never stopped, engines rattling through the night, the smell of gasoline that clung to uniforms. If the Germans remembered going without, Americans remembered never having enough sleep. Films and novels after the war elevated the Red Ball into legend. They showed convoys racing through France as if they alone sustained victory. The truth was more complex. The Express was a layer, an emergency artery within a larger circulatory system. Ports, rail, and pipelines bore equal or greater loads. Yet myths endure for a reason. The Red Ball was the visible face of logistics. Trucks on roads, men behind wheels, mud on boots. It captured in a single image what otherwise was too vast and abstract to see. The legacy did not end in 1945. Many Red Ball veterans returned home to fight a different battle, the struggle for civil rights. Their service was proof that African Americans had carried more than their share, and that segregation was both unjust and absurd. Oral histories recorded their quiet pride. "They didn't see us in parades," one veteran said, "but they'd have seen the war stop if we hadn't driven." Their story fed into a broader reckoning, the realization that freedom fought for abroad demanded freedom at home. By 1945, the Red Ball Express was gone. Its trucks had been reassigned, its name folded into history, but its imprint remained. In Eisenhower's praise, in Truman's policy, in the memories of drivers who kept their eyes open on French roads when victory depended on their endurance. The irony still stands. In the most mechanized war in history, America's decisive advantage came not from tanks or planes but from wheels, and from the men, segregated and unsung, who kept those wheels turning.